Royal guards searched Camilla's closet. What they found belonged to the late Queen's coronation. There is a room inside Buckingham Palace that most people will never see. It sits behind a corridor that smells faintly of old wood and beeswax polish, past a set of double doors that are always kept shut, in the private residential wing where the noise of central London never quite manages to reach. There are no tourists here, no guided tours, no velvet ropes, no plaques on the walls explaining what anything is or why it matters. This part of the palace exists for the people who actually live here, and it has been arranged accordingly, not for display, not for impression, but for living. The room itself is without grandeur. That is perhaps the most striking thing about it, if you could see it. No gilded mirrors, no enormous portraits of kings gazing down from the walls, no crystal chandeliers throwing light across polished floors. Just a private space, quiet and carefully arranged, smelling of cedar wood, where rows of garments hang in the particular stillness of things that are worn only on certain occasions and stored with care the rest of the time. Shelves along one wall hold boxes and cases of the kind that are used when you need to keep something safe and out of the light. A dressing table, a chair upholstered in a faded print fabric, the ordinary furniture of a private life, sitting inside a very extraordinary building. Rooms like this one tell you more about a person than any public appearance ever could. The things people keep privately, the things they fold carefully and tuck away and never mention to anyone, those are the things that carry the real story, not the curated version, not the official version, the real one, underneath everything. And in the autumn of 2022, a small team of royal protection officers walked quietly into exactly that kind of room. They were there on routine business, the kind of work that happens in palaces without fanfare, without press coverage, without any public awareness whatsoever, the kind that keeps the entire operation running smoothly in the background while the front-facing world of royal life, the ceremonies and speeches and walkabouts and public engagements, carries on above it. They were cataloging, cross-referencing, making sure that everything was where it was supposed to be during the careful and painstaking process of transitioning from one reign to another. Queen Elizabeth II had died in September of that year, at Balmoral Castle in Scotland, on the 8th day of the month, in the late afternoon. She was 96 years old. She had been queen for 70 years and 214 days, the longest reign in British history and one of the longest in European history. King Charles III had taken the throne the moment she drew her final breath, as constitutional law required, and the palace had already begun the process of reorganizing itself for a new era, new stationery, new coats of arms, new protocols, new staff arrangements, the institution adapting, as it always adapts to changed circumstances, while maintaining the surface of continuity that is so important to what it represents and what it stands for. The officers who walked into the wardrobe room that autumn afternoon were professionals who had been doing this kind of work for years. They knew how to move through private spaces without disturbing anything, without making the space feel intruded upon, without leaving any trace that they had been there except the notation in their logs. Check, verify, move on. They worked methodically through the list. They were not expecting anything unusual. They were not looking for anything unusual. But at the back of the wardrobe room, behind a cedar-panelled door that was built so neatly into the wall that it would be easy to miss if you didn't know it was there, they found something that none of their training, none of their experience, and none of their expectations had prepared them for. What lay before them, wrapped with extraordinary care in layers of aged tissue paper and placed on a shelf as if they were the most ordinary things in the world, were objects that did not belong to Queen Consort Camilla. They had never belonged to Camilla. Every stitch, every fold of silk, every carefully preserved detail pointed unmistakably back to a single morning in British history, a morning that had taken place more than 70 years before that autumn afternoon, in Westminster Abbey, when a 27-year-old princess had knelt before the Archbishop of Canterbury and been anointed and crowned Queen of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The objects belonged to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II on the 2nd of June 1953, and they had been placed in that wardrobe deliberately, carefully, and in complete private secrecy, by Elizabeth herself, in the final months of her life. To understand why the discovery of those objects matters as much as it does, you first have to understand what the coronation of 1953 actually was. Not just what it looked like from the outside, not just the pageantry and the ceremony and the golden coach moving through the streets of London. You have to understand what it meant, to the people who watched it, to the country that needed it, and above all to the young woman standing at the center of it. Britain in 1953 was not the country it had been before the Second World War. The war had changed everything and everyone. The great cities still bore the scars of the Blitz, bomb sites where buildings had stood, gaps in rows of houses, whole streets that simply ended in rubble and weeds, and the wild plants that grow where walls have been. Rationing had only just ended, and many foods had been rationed longer after the war than during it. The return of things like sugar and sweets and fresh butter to ordinary family tables was still relatively new and still felt like something worth noticing and being grateful for. People were tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion, a tiredness of spirit that comes from years of sustained difficulty, of holding on through things that required more than any reasonable measure of endurance, and now finding themselves on the other side of it and not quite sure what to do with the space. The country needed something to look forward to, not in a frivolous sense, in a genuinely human sense, the need, which is not trivial, to have a moment of celebration and brightness and shared feeling, something to push against the gray. The coronation gave them that. It gave them a morning to plan for and look forward to and dress up for, a spectacle to celebrate, a collective moment of color and ceremony in a world that had, for a very long time, been the color of rationing and rubble and war. People saved up specifically to buy a television set, just to watch the coronation. Those who could not afford one crowded into the sitting rooms of neighbors and relatives who had one. Sometimes 15 or 20 people packed into a small room around a small black and white screen, watching history unfold. It was the first coronation to be televised in full. There had been fierce debate about whether to allow cameras into Westminster Abbey at all, with some arguing that the sanctity of the ceremony would be compromised by being broadcast into ordinary living rooms across the country. Elizabeth herself had had to make a decision on this, and she had decided for the cameras, for the openness, for the sharing. 27 million people in Britain watched it. Around the world, the number was in the hundreds of millions. June the 2nd was a cold and rainy day in London. Not unusual for early English summer, but disappointing given how much was at stake and how many people had planned to be outside. None of it mattered. 3 million people lined the procession route anyway, many of them having spent the night on the pavements, wrapped in coats and blankets and sheer determination, just to be there, just to catch a glimpse of the golden coach as it rolled past. They cheered and waved flags, and some of them wept, pressed against the barriers with the particular energy of people who know they are watching something they will tell their children and grandchildren about. Inside Westminster Abbey, 2,000 guests filled every seat. The building, more than 1,000 years old in its foundations, built and rebuilt and extended over the centuries, the burial place of kings and queens, reaching back almost to the Norman conquest, seemed on that particular morning to become something more than architecture. The light came through the great windows and fell across the nave in long shafts. The music of the choir rose to the ceiling. And at the center of all of it, walking with remarkable stillness through all that weight of history and expectation, came a young woman dressed in white. Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor was 27 years old. She had been formally queen since February of the previous year, when her father, King George VI, had died quietly in the night at Sandringham, and she, thousands of miles away on a royal tour in Kenya, had gone to bed as a princess and woken up as a queen. She had been told by her private secretary. The accounts of that moment vary slightly in their detail, as such accounts always do, but they agree on the essentials. She received the news with composure. She understood immediately what it meant. She did not collapse or wail or demand to be taken home. She absorbed it, and within hours she was managing her first duties as the new sovereign. That composure, that capacity to absorb enormous things without visible disintegration, would define her entire reign of 7 decades. But it was not coldness. People who were closest to her were clear on that. It was discipline. The discipline of someone who had understood, from a very young age, that the role she had been born into demanded more of her than her own feelings at any given moment, and who had decided to give what was demanded of her without complaint. The coronation, 15 months after her accession, was not the moment she became queen. That had already happened. The coronation was the moment the world watched her accept the full weight of what she had become, and consecrate it, and commit to it in the most solemn possible way. It was, in that sense, less a political event than a spiritual one, and Elizabeth treated it absolutely as such. She prepared for it with the kind of thoroughness that impressed even the people who were helping her prepare, and those people had high standards. She studied the order of service in precise detail, learning every step, every piece of music, every cue, every moment at which she would need to move or speak or remain still. She rehearsed the ceremony with the Archbishop of Canterbury, going through it section by section, until she knew it not just intellectually but in her body. She practiced walking in the full coronation robes, which were elaborate and heavy enough that moving gracefully in them required considerable preparation. She learned the exact weight of the crown of St. Edward, more than 2 kilograms of gold set with jewels, and practiced holding her head at the angle that would allow it to be worn for hours without the muscles of her neck crying out. She did not, by any account, find this excessive or burdensome. She did not complain about the weight of the crown, or the complexity of the ceremony, or the extraordinary demands it made. She found it necessary. She believed, genuinely and deeply, in a way that very few people outside her immediate personal circle fully understood, because she almost never spoke about it publicly, that what was happening on the 2nd of June was not a performance. It was a covenant, a binding agreement between herself and the people she was going to serve and the God in whom she sincerely believed. The ceremony itself lasted 3 hours and 28 minutes. The words used were drawn from a script that had barely changed in 1,000 years, reaching back to the coronation of King Edgar at Bath in 973 AD. Every English monarch for 1,000 years had been crowned using essentially the same words, the same gestures, the same sequence of acts. The anointing oil, poured onto Elizabeth's hands and forehead and chest, was made from a recipe of orange blossom and roses and cinnamon and musk and other ingredients that had been prepared in the same way for generations. The crown of St. Edward, placed on her head at the culminating moment, had been made in 1661 for the coronation of Charles II and had been placed on the head of every monarch since. She bore all of it with perfect stillness. She did not shift in her seat, did not blink at a wrong moment, did not betray by any visible sign the fact that she was a 27-year-old woman in an enormous building under the eyes of millions of people, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of history on her head. She sat in the coronation chair, ancient and worn with the use of centuries, and she held it. She was 27 years old, and she held it without flinching. People who were in the Abbey that morning, those who wrote about it afterward, and those who gave interviews decades later when they were very old and the morning was very far away, always struggled to explain what the atmosphere had been like. They reached for words, solemn, sacred, overwhelming, once in a lifetime, and they always felt, in the end, that the words fell short. Something had happened in that building on that morning that went beyond ceremony and politics and tradition. A feeling had moved through the crowd and touched people somewhere they couldn't name, in a place that wasn't addressed by ordinary experience. Something that did not belong to spectacle but to somewhere older and quieter and more fundamental. Elizabeth felt it too. The notes she made privately, in her own hand, in the margins of her personal copy of the Order of Service, make that completely clear. They are not the marks of someone going through the motions of a grand occasion. They are the marks of someone who was, in the truest sense of the phrase, fully present, who was genuinely moved, who was reaching, consciously and with great intention, towards something she believed was real. On the page for the anointing, the most sacred part of the entire ceremony, the part that was not televised, the part at which a canopy was held over her so that the cameras could not film it, the part she later described privately as the most deeply affecting moment of the whole day, she had written 5 words in pencil, in the margin, in her neat and careful hand. Remember, this moment belongs to God, not to us. 5 words, written to herself, by herself, in private, in the last hours before she walked into Westminster Abbey and became, for the rest of her life, the woman the world knew as Queen Elizabeth II. Not for the public, not for the record, for no one except herself. That single sentence tells you almost everything essential about who she was, about the faith that sat at the absolute center of her private life, about the way she understood the role she was accepting, not as something that belonged to her personally, not as something she owned or controlled, but as something entrusted to her, something she held on behalf of something larger than herself, something she would be accountable for. At some level she believed in but rarely if ever spoke about in public. She believed it was not about her. She wrote it down to remind herself, and she kept the program with those words on it for the rest of her life. And then, in her final months, she gave it to Camilla. To fully understand the weight of that act, you have to understand the history between Elizabeth and Camilla. The whole of it, not just the parts that made the newspapers. The story begins, as almost everything in this story does, with Charles. Charles Philip Arthur George, the Prince of Wales, born in November 1948, the eldest child of Princess Elizabeth and her husband Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh. From the moment of his birth, the fundamental shape of his entire life was already determined in ways that had nothing to do with his own preferences, or personality, or what he might have wanted for himself. He was going to be king. That was the beginning and the middle and the end of it. Everything else, what he cared about, who he loved, what kind of man he was on the inside, was, in the formal structure of the institution he had been born into, secondary to that central and unalterable fact. He grew into a thoughtful, somewhat melancholy man who cared deeply about architecture and the natural environment and traditional craftsmanship and the things that were being quietly lost in the modern world. He was willing to say so publicly at a time when public figures with platforms generally didn't rock the boat on such matters. He painted in watercolor. He wrote a children's book. He was earnest and sincere in ways that sometimes made him look awkward in a world that tended to reward breezy surface confidence over genuine interior depth. He was not straightforwardly charismatic in the way that the most beloved royals often managed to be. He was more complicated than that, and the complications were visible in ways that simpler people's complications are not, because he lived his life in public. Camilla Shand, as she was then, was born in July 1947, the daughter of a British Army officer, into the world of the English countryside establishment, the world of horses and dogs and long walks and dinner parties where everyone already knows each other. She was direct in her manner, which is rarer than it sounds in the social worlds she moved through. She was funny in the way that people are funny when they are genuinely comfortable in their own skin, quick and observant and irreverent without being cruel about it. She had a laugh that filled rooms. She was not the kind of beauty that photographs particularly well. Something about the quality of her presence translated better in person than on a printed page. But people who met her in person very often found her unexpectedly compelling. She was entirely and comfortably herself, and in a world full of performance, that kind of ease stands out. She and Charles met in the early 1970s, moving in the same social circles, and something happened between them that neither of them ever entirely resolved. What exactly it was, how serious, how defined, how clearly understood on both sides, has been written about and speculated over endlessly, and the full truth of it belongs to the two people involved. What is beyond dispute is that it mattered, to both of them, in a way that proved to be more durable than either of them might have expected. Circumstances separated them. Charles had duties that took him away. Camilla married someone else, an army officer, a decent man who cared for her. And Charles, under the accumulated pressure of an institution that needed its heir to produce a successor and a public that wanted its prince to have a fairy tale, married Diana Spencer in July 1981 in a ceremony that was watched by 750 million people around the world. The wedding was genuinely spectacular, in the visual sense. The horse-drawn carriage, the cathedral, the 25-foot train on the wedding dress, the crowded streets, the balcony kiss. People cried from happiness on the pavements of London. People had parties in garden squares. For a bright, brief moment, it felt like something genuinely enchanted was happening. The press called it the wedding of the century, and they were not wrong about the scale of it. But behind the enchantment was a marriage between two people who did not know each other well, and who would discover, in the years that followed, that they were not well matched in the ways that matter most for a lifetime. Diana was 19 when the engagement was announced, and 20 when she married. She had entered the most scrutinized family in the world, with very little preparation for what that would mean for her daily life, her inner life, her sense of who she was. She was a warm and empathetic young woman who found the formality and the emotional constraints of royal life genuinely painful. She struggled. She said so, eventually, to people who wrote it down. Charles was a man whose emotional life had never been given much room to exist on its own terms, inside the institutional structure he had been raised in, and he found himself in a marriage that was creaking under pressures he did not know how to address. The gap between the relationship as it appeared in public and the relationship as it was in private grew wider over the years, and the distance was painful for both of them. The marriage ended formally in divorce in 1996. Diana died in a car crash in Paris in August 1997. The grief that followed her death was enormous and fast, and had a ferocity that astonished virtually everyone, including the people who had been closest to her. More than 1 million bouquets of flowers were laid at the gates of Kensington Palace in the week following her death. Queues to sign condolence books stretched for miles. People who had never met her, who knew her only from photographs and television, sobbed openly in the streets of cities across the world. And some of that grief turned, as raw grief sometimes does, into anger that needed somewhere to go. A great deal of it went toward Camilla. She was cast, in the public narrative that formed quickly and hardened fast, as the villain of the story, the person responsible for the breaking of the fairy tale, the third party in the marriage, the one whose presence was implicated in Diana's unhappiness. The years following Diana's death were, for Camilla, genuinely difficult in ways that people who have not experienced that kind of sustained public hostility sometimes find hard to fully appreciate. She could not go out in public without the risk of something unpleasant happening. There were moments that were serious enough to worry the people responsible for her safety. There were letters that were disturbing. There was a period when the combination of press intrusion and public anger made ordinary daily life, going to a shop, attending a social event, traveling in a car, complicated and at times frightening. And yet she did not leave. She did not walk away from Charles, did not give in to the pressure of the situation by removing herself from it. She stayed, and she waited, and during those years of waiting, she did something that tends to get overlooked in the summary version of the story. She worked. She had been involved for years with causes focused on literacy and osteoporosis, and, particularly, domestic abuse. She continued that work during the most hostile years of public opinion, turning up to events and meetings and fundraising occasions where the cameras were sometimes there and sometimes not, doing the work whether anyone was watching or not. She made herself useful in ways that had nothing to do with public image management, and she was good at it. Genuinely, measurably good at it. This matters because of what it reveals about character. When there is no visible reward for behaving decently, when the public approval is entirely absent, when the right thing and the easy thing are pointing in completely different directions, the choice of how to behave is much more revealing than it is in comfortable circumstances. Camilla chose, consistently, to keep doing the right thing by the people she had made commitments to, by the causes she had taken on, by the work she had said she would do. She did it without making a fuss about it. She did it without drawing attention to herself, and she did it for years. Elizabeth was watching all of it. She had the information, the vantage point, the long view. She saw what was being reported publicly, and she saw what was actually happening. Those are not always the same thing, and Elizabeth, who had been dealing with the gap between those two things for her entire reign, was better equipped than almost anyone to tell the difference. The relationship between Elizabeth and Camilla shifted slowly, over many years, in ways that were almost invisible from the outside but were real and significant to the people inside the situation. It began with small things. A shared appearance at a minor event, notable mainly for the fact that it had been allowed to happen. A photograph that was slightly less carefully managed than the ones before, slightly more candid, slightly more suggestive of two people actually being in the same room by choice. The people who work closest in royal households have a particular skill, developed over years, of reading what is actually happening from the smallest of cues. The angle at which two people stand in relation to each other, whether eye contact is made and held, or merely performed and released. Whether laughter, when it occurs, reaches the face or stays at the mouth. They read these things because they are paid to understand what is actually going on in the rooms they work in, and because their ability to do their jobs well depends on that understanding. What these people reported, over the years when Elizabeth and Camilla were increasingly sharing space both privately and publicly, was a warming that was not manufactured, a comfort in each other's company that could not be entirely explained by professional courtesy or institutional necessity. There were private dinners, at Sandringham or Balmoral or Windsor, at which the table was small and the guests were few, and the level of formality was low. At those dinners, people who were present described an ease that surprised them, shared references, private jokes, the particular shorthand that develops between two people who have spent enough time together to have their own language. Shared humor, when it is genuine, is not a minor thing. It is a form of deep recognition. To find the same things funny means seeing the world in a similar enough way that the absurdities and ironies and oddities of it land in the same place for both of you. You cannot fake that kind of alignment. Elizabeth, who was known for a dry private wit that rarely reached the public but was well attested by those who knew her, found in Camilla someone who matched her. Camilla, who had always been funny in the easy, unconscious way of people who are simply being themselves, found in Elizabeth someone who got it. In 2005, when Charles and Camilla married in a civil ceremony at Windsor, Elizabeth did not attend the ceremony itself. She was there for the religious blessing that followed, and the photographs of her from that day show a woman at ease, not performing ease, not smiling for the cameras in the way that requires a conscious effort, actually at ease. The difference is visible to anyone who has studied enough images of Elizabeth over the decades to know how her face looks when she is doing something because she wants to, and how it looks when she is doing something because she must. The years between 2005 and 2022 saw a gradual but genuine deepening of whatever had grown between the two women. They had things in common that mattered. Both were women who understood, from long personal experience, the particular pressures of being female in a royal role that was designed around male expectations and that demanded a constant management of public perception that the men in the same institution rarely had to think about in quite the same way. Both had spent decades keeping the most authentic version of themselves firmly out of public view, presenting the face that was required while keeping the real one for the very few moments and very few people where it was safe to be less guarded. In that experience, the experience of sustained interiority, of living at some significant remove from your own feelings for much of the time because the role demanded it, they were more alike than the surface of their lives might suggest. And that likeness, recognized over time, built a kind of understanding between them that went deeper than the political calculation of two women making the best of a complicated situation. In February 2022, in her written statement for the Platinum Jubilee, Elizabeth stated publicly, and on the record, that it was her sincere wish that Camilla would be known as Queen Consort when the time came. She did not have to do that. She was not asked to do that. She was 95 years old, and she knew, with the clarity of someone who had dealt with reality directly for a very long time, that the time she was referring to was not far away. She chose to make the statement because she wanted the record to be clear, and because, those who knew her believe, she genuinely meant it. That public statement was significant, but what the wardrobe reveals is that in private, she had already gone much, much further. The final year of Elizabeth's life was lived largely away from public view, though accounts from those who were with her during that period are consistent and clear. She was physically diminished, lighter and slower and more easily tired than she had been even a year before. The mobility difficulties that had been quietly managed and as quietly underreported for the previous few years had become more pronounced. She used a walking stick regularly now. There were engagements she could not fulfill and events she could not attend, but her mind remained entirely her own. This is the thing that those who were close to her in that period emphasized consistently, as if wanting to make sure it was on record. Her mind was sharp and present and engaged. She still read her government papers each day. She still held private audiences with ministers and heads of state. She still, on the occasions when her health allowed, appeared in public, and when she did, she was immediately and unmistakably herself. The quality of attention she gave to people, the genuine interest she took in them, the way she made them feel, in the moment she was speaking with them, that they were the most interesting person in the room, all of that remained completely intact. She was also, in those final months, doing the thing that people who have lived long enough and honestly enough tend to do when the end approaches. She was putting things in order, not just the formal things, the legal documents and succession papers and estate matters that had been prepared and organized over decades and needed only to be finalized, but the personal things, the private things, the things that wouldn't be handled by lawyers or documented in any archive, because they were too personal and too intimate and too much a matter of individual meaning to be reduced to paperwork. She was deciding who should have what. She was looking at the things around her, the things she had kept for years, the things that marked particular moments and particular people and particular mornings, the things that carried a weight that was entirely separate from their material value. And she was deciding who would understand them, who would take care of them properly, who had earned the right, in the private and unannounced sense of earning that mattered to her, to receive them. This is not unusual. Most people who reach the end of a long life go through some version of this process. They look at the objects around them and think about the people in their lives, and they make decisions, sometimes formal ones, sometimes not, about where things should go. The most meaningful decisions often are the informal ones, the things given by hand, in private, without any paperwork, the things passed from one person to another in the understanding that the receiver knows what they are being given and why it matters. Elizabeth made several such decisions in those final months. Objects were passed quietly to people she trusted, without official process, by hand. Not all of them have become known. Not all of them ever will. But among the ones that did eventually come to light were the 3 objects she gave to Camilla. What was said when she gave them, whether there were words at all, or whether the objects were simply handed over in the way that some things are given, with a look, with a held silence, with the understanding that explanation would be beside the point, is not known. The people who might know are not talking, and that is, in itself, entirely consistent with the character of both women. The 3 items deserve to be described in some detail, because each one carries its own significance, and together they form a kind of deliberate statement, even if that statement was never meant to be public. The first is the ceremonial sash, made of heavy ivory silk, the kind of silk that was produced before synthetic fibers changed the texture of everything. It is wide enough that when worn across a shoulder and fastened at the hip, it makes a significant visual impact. Along both edges runs hand-embroidered decoration in gold thread, thistles for Scotland, roses for England, leeks for Wales, shamrocks for Ireland, woven together in a pattern that is complex but disciplined, formal without being cold. The embroidery was done by hand, as was almost all the needlework for the coronation, by teams of women who worked in dedicated rooms in the months leading up to June 1953, their eyes close to the fabric, their needles moving in careful repetition through silk that would eventually be worn in one of the most photographed moments in modern history. They were doing their craft at the highest possible level, on behalf of an occasion that demanded nothing less. The quality of their work is visible still. The gold thread has not tarnished after 70 years. It still catches the light in exactly the way it was designed to catch the light, and it is still as close to perfect as it was the day it was finished. The second item is the presentation box containing the gloves. The box itself is walnut, old now but still handsome, lined in dark blue velvet that has faded at the edges to a softer, dustier shade. The gloves inside are white kidskin, the finest grade, so soft that the material seems almost weightless. They reached to just above the wrist, on the inside of each wrist, where they would be visible only to the person wearing them and to anyone who helped put them on or take them off, is a monogram in silver thread, E.R. Elizabeth Regina. These gloves were worn once. On the morning of June 2, 1953, during the ceremony in Westminster Abbey. After the ceremony, they were carefully removed, folded, placed in this box, and stored. There was only ever one morning for which they had been made, and that morning had passed, and since then they had waited. For 70 years they had been kept in the dark of a storage location, and they had waited, and the silver thread of the monogram had not shifted or faded or unraveled by so much as a single stitch. E.R. Still crisp, still clear, still completely legible, still marking those gloves as belonging to no one else. Before going further into what the objects are, it is worth pausing on the setting in which they were found, because the setting matters. Buckingham Palace is not one building in the way that most buildings are one building. It is more like a small town that has been folded into the shape of a house. It has 775 rooms. It has a post office, a cinema, a swimming pool, a doctor's surgery, a police station, a staff cafeteria, and a large internal courtyard garden that functions as a park for the people who live and work inside the building. Hundreds of people work there. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. The front of it faces the mall, where the tourists gather and the photographers wait, and the back of it faces an enormous private garden that almost no ordinary member of the public has ever seen. The private residential rooms, the places where the royal family actually lives, where the clothes are kept, and the books are on the shelves, and the private correspondent sits on the desk, are on the upper floors of the north and east wings, separated from the official staterooms by long corridors and sets of doors that are kept locked by people who understand the difference between what is public and what is not. In those private rooms, the atmosphere is different from the rest of the palace. Quieter, less formal, less like an institution and more like a home, albeit a home with an unusually large staff and an unusually complex set of protocols governing who goes where and when. The furniture is more personal, more chosen for comfort than for impression. There are family photographs on the surfaces in a way that the staterooms, arranged for official display, never have. There are reading glasses left on side tables and books, with bookmarks in them, and the small accumulated evidence of people actually living their lives rather than performing their lives for an audience. The wardrobe room in which the items were found was at the far end of one of these private corridors. Cedar-lined, as many such storage spaces in older British houses are, because cedar wood has a natural quality that deters moths and helps preserve textiles. The smell of cedar in a room like that is a particular smell, distinctly itself, slightly sweet and slightly dry, the smell of preservation and care and old things kept safe. It is not an unpleasant smell, it is the smell of things being looked after. The items were on a shelf near the back of the room, behind the cedar-panelled door. They were not hidden in any dramatic sense. They were not locked away or concealed under anything, or placed somewhere that would require searching to find. They were simply there, wrapped carefully, in a space that was private in the ordinary sense, accessible to Camilla and to the small number of people who helped her in her private rooms, not accessible to anyone who had no business being there. They were the kind of things that sit undisturbed, not because they are hidden, but because they are in the part of a life that is genuinely private, and the people around you respect that privacy. The tissue paper in which they were wrapped was old. Not the same age as the objects themselves, but old enough to suggest that whoever had wrapped them had done so years ago, not recently. Whether Elizabeth wrapped them herself or had them wrapped by someone she trusted absolutely and then took them is not known, but the care of the wrapping was evident. Each object had been treated individually, given its own layers, folded in a way that protected it from pressure and light. Nothing had been thrown together carelessly. Everything had been done with attention. That attention to the physical objects is itself a form of information. It tells you that the person who wrapped them understood what they were, understood that they required care, not because they were materially fragile, though old silk and old leather are fragile in practical terms, but because they mattered, because they carried something that required the same kind of careful treatment that you give to anything you consider precious. The third object is the most quietly extraordinary of the three. It is the program, the personal order of service that Elizabeth carried with her on the morning of the coronation. Not an official copy, not a display piece, but the actual working document she used, the one she had read and marked, and held in her own hands in the hours before she walked into Westminster Abbey and during the service itself. The paper is slightly softened with age, its edges very faintly yellowed in the way that old paper yellows regardless of how carefully you store it, if you store it long enough. The cover bears the royal cipher in gold ink. Inside, the pages are in the formal typeface of 1950s official printing. Most of what is there is formal and expected: the order of the ceremony, the texts of the prayers, the words of the hymns. But in the margins, in pencil, in the neat and precise and beautifully trained handwriting of a woman who had been educated to write carefully and who never lost that habit through 7 decades of documents and letters and state papers, there are notes. Many of the marginal notes are practical, timing cues written to herself, notes about when to stand or sit or move, about the sequence of what comes next, about which piece of music follows which reading. She had learned the ceremony with great thoroughness, but she also knew that thoroughness in preparation and performance in the moment are different things, and she had used the margins of the program as a way of embedding the knowledge more deeply, of making the sequence absolutely certain in her own mind before the moment of needing it arrived. But among the practical notes are others, personal ones, lines that were not written as reminders of what to do, but as anchors for what to feel, as handrails for a moment that was going to be, by any human measure, overwhelming, because she was 27 years old and she was about to be anointed Queen of England, and the weight of that, the sheer incomprehensible weight of that, was not something any amount of rehearsal could fully prepare a person for. On the page for the anointing, the part that was not filmed, the part at which a ceremonial canopy was held over her, the part she later described privately as the most deeply affecting moment of the entire service, she had written in the margin in pencil, "Remember, this moment belongs to God, not to us, not to the institution, not to the crown, not to the government or the people watching or the cameras or the procession or the history books, to God." And the word "not to us" suggests she was speaking to herself as part of something larger than herself, reminding herself that she was not the point of this, that the role she was accepting was not hers to own, that she was a steward and not an owner, a servant and not a ruler, and that the proper response to being placed at the center of a moment this large was not pride, but something closer to the opposite of pride. That single sentence, written in pencil in the margin of a program on the morning of June 2, 1953, tells you more about who Elizabeth Windsor was than almost anything else that has been written about her in the decades since. It tells you about the faith that lived at the core of her and that she almost never talked about publicly. It tells you about how she understood the role she was accepting, not as something given to her but as something entrusted to her, on terms that she took seriously, in a way that was entirely private and entirely genuine. It tells you why she was able to carry that role for 70 years, without the kind of visible resentment or exhaustion that you might reasonably expect from someone who had given so completely of themselves to something that demanded everything. She believed it wasn't about her. She wrote it down. She kept it for 70 years. And then she gave it to Camilla. The royal protection officers who found the items followed their training exactly as they were supposed to. They noted what they had discovered, they reported it correctly through the chain, and the information made its way to the people who needed to know about it. The Royal Collection Trust was brought in. Conservators and curators with long experience in handling objects of significance arrived and began the careful work of assessment and authentication. The process was thorough. The sash was cross-referenced against wardrobe inventories from the Coronation period. The gloves were matched against known descriptions in the official records. The program was the most delicate matter, because while many copies had survived in various collections and archives, this one was different, and the difference lay in the handwriting. 2 independent document examiners were brought in without being told the full context of what they were looking at. Each was given high-resolution images of the annotations alongside verified samples of the handwriting in question. Each returned the same conclusion. The handwriting in the program margins was that of Queen Elizabeth II. There was no serious doubt. The items were transferred formally to the Trust's conservation facility at Windsor Castle, where they were assessed and stabilized with the care that their age and significance required. The gloves went into archival storage. The sash was laid flat in conditions designed to halt any further deterioration of the silk or the gold thread. The program was given the most delicate treatment of all, its pages interleaved with acid-free tissue, the pencil annotations photographed and recorded before any further handling. All three items, the conservators confirmed, were in a state of preservation that reflected extraordinary care in their storage. Whoever had kept them very well. Camilla was informed about the discovery in a private meeting, attended only by a small number of people who needed to be there. Those present have not spoken about the meeting publicly. But from what has reached the people who knew the people in the room, a picture can be assembled. She was composed. She confirmed without being asked more than once that the items had been given to her personally by the late Queen, passed from Elizabeth's hands to hers in private, without witnesses, without documentation. She confirmed that she had placed them in her wardrobe herself and that she had not disclosed their existence to anyone. When the question of why she had not disclosed them was asked, she was quiet for a moment before she answered, and then she said, "She didn't ask me to tell anyone. And I didn't think she'd want me to." That was her explanation. All of it. No further elaboration, no apology, no attempt to justify or contextualize. Just that. The people in the room found, perhaps unexpectedly, that they understood it immediately, because Elizabeth had been, above all else and in every aspect of her life, a woman who drew a firm and consistent line between what was private and what was public. The things she gave, when she gave them privately, were given in the full understanding that the recipient would maintain that privacy. Not because she asked them to explicitly, in most cases, but because the act of giving privately was itself the instruction. The privacy was part of the gift. You did not honor a private gift by making it public. You honored it by keeping it private. Camilla had understood that perfectly. She had received those objects in the spirit in which they were given, and she had kept them in that spirit, and she had not said a word to anyone. That was not evasiveness. That was loyalty. A specific, careful, genuine loyalty to the person who had given her something that mattered enormously and had trusted her to understand what mattered about it. What does it mean that Elizabeth chose Camilla? Of all the people she might have given those objects to, her children, her grandchildren, the friends of decades, the staff who had served her faithfully for years, she chose Camilla. She chose to place the most intimate physical remnants of the most important morning of her life in the hands of someone the public had once regarded as the last person in the world deserving of anything that carried the royal family's trust. The only interpretation that holds together, the only one that is consistent with everything else known about Elizabeth, about how she thought and what she valued and how she made decisions, is that she had arrived, by the end of her life, at a private and genuine conviction about who Camilla was. Not the public version, not the version that had been constructed by newspapers and documentaries and decades of complicated public narrative. The real version, built from years of direct and close observation, from private dinners and quiet conversations and shared moments that never made any record anywhere. Elizabeth had watched Camilla for years. She had seen her in easy situations and difficult ones, in public moments and private ones, in circumstances where she was being observed, and in circumstances where she was not. She had seen how Camilla behaved when there was nothing to gain from behaving well, when the public approval was absent, when the institution was not watching closely, when it would have been entirely understandable to cut corners, or take shortcuts, or simply do a little less. And she had seen, consistently, that Camilla did not do those things, that she showed up, that she kept her commitments, that she did the work, quietly and without fuss, because she believed it was worth doing. And she had seen, this is perhaps the most important thing, that Camilla had never tried to be anything other than what she was, had never attempted to reinvent herself entirely, never tried to perform a version of royal virtue that was too polished and too deliberate to be convincing. She had simply continued being herself, direct, warm, funny, a little irreverent, more interested in the people she was working with than in how she appeared to be while working with them, and had let that speak for itself, and it had spoken for itself. Slowly, over many years, undeniably, Elizabeth's private assessment of people was known, by those who had worked closest to her, to be both accurate and durable. She did not revise her opinion of people quickly or casually. She formed it over time, through observation, and once it was formed it tended to stick. And what she had formed, over the years of watching Camilla, was an assessment that said, this person can be trusted with the most important things, so she gave her the most important things, privately, directly, by hand, without ceremony, without the institution present, without any record. She placed the coronation sash and the coronation gloves and the program with the handwritten note in the margin in Camilla's hands, and she let the objects say what they said, and she trusted Camilla to receive them in the spirit in which they were given. There is also the question of what this discovery means for how we understand the coronation artifacts themselves, and what it means for the way the royal collection functions and the way royal history is made and recorded. The Royal Collection Trust, which manages the collection of over 1 million objects held in trust for the Crown, operates with extraordinary rigor. Every object is documented, every location is tracked, every movement from one place to another goes through proper channels. This is not bureaucracy for its own sake, but a practical necessity when you are responsible for objects that include works of art, pieces of furniture, manuscripts, jewelry, and ceremonial items accumulated over 500 years of royal history. The collection is, by any measure, one of the greatest collections in the world, and keeping track of it requires exactly the kind of systematic rigor that the trust applies. Which is why the coronation items, when they were found, represented something genuinely unusual. Not because objects occasionally turn up in unexpected places, they do, and the trust is experienced in handling that, but because of the specific circumstances. These were not objects that had drifted out of their official location through the kind of gradual institutional drift that happens when records are kept imperfectly, or when objects move from storage to storage over decades without every transfer being precisely logged. These were objects that had been taken from their official storage deliberately, given by hand, and kept privately for a sustained period. That was different in kind from the ordinary categories of unexpected discovery. The trust's response was handled with the care and discretion that the situation required. The objects were assessed, the authentication was completed, the conservation needs were evaluated. The formal transfer back into official custody was done without any public announcement, without any press involvement, in the quiet way that institutions of this kind prefer to handle matters that have a personal dimension. The people involved understood, without needing to be told explicitly, that what they were dealing with was not just a collection management matter, it was a human matter, a private matter, and it deserved to be treated as such. Understanding the royal collection also helps you understand why the coronation items carry such particular weight within it. The collection is vast, and it spans an enormous range of objects, from Raphael paintings to pieces of Roman pottery, from suits of armor to pieces of furniture that belonged to monarchs who lived 5 centuries ago. Within that vast range, there are certain categories that carry an almost exceptional symbolic charge. The coronation artifacts are among them. The regalia used at coronations, the crowns, the orb, the scepters, the spurs, the rings, are held in the Jewel House at the Tower of London, where millions of people visit them each year. They are the most directly potent symbols of monarchical power in the entire collection, and they are treated accordingly. But around them, in the broader category of coronation-related objects, are things like the vestments worn by the monarch, the personal effects used during the service, the programs and orders of service, the ceremonial dress. And those objects, while less immediately dramatic than the crown jewels, carry their own extraordinary weight precisely because they were personal. They were used. They were in contact with the person at the center of everything. To hold one of those objects is, in a very literal sense, to hold something that was there. That was present at that specific morning in Westminster Abbey in June 1953, when something that had not happened in 16 years and would not happen again for another 70 happened. The objects did not merely witness the ceremony, they participated in it. They were worn by a young woman who was making the most serious promises of her life, in public, before God, before her country, before history. They carry that mourning in them. And Elizabeth, who understood this as well as anyone alive, who had herself been that young woman in that morning, chose to give certain of those objects to Camilla. The conversation about what this means, in terms of royal history and the relationships within the royal family, and the complex half-private story of how the current reign came to be what it is, will continue for a long time. Historians and biographers and commentators will return to it, will find new angles and new implications, will set it in relation to other events and other decisions and other private moments that may or may not eventually come to light. That is how history works. It is assembled gradually, from partial accounts and incomplete records and the occasional discovery of something, like 3 wrapped objects in a cedar-lined wardrobe, that shifts the picture. But the essential meaning of what happened is not complex. It does not require academic analysis or historical context to be understood. It requires only the recognition that what Elizabeth did was a genuine act, not performed for anyone, not calculated for effect, not designed to create a narrative or manage an image. It was simply what it was, a private decision, made by a woman at the end of a long life, about who she trusted and what she wanted to give them, about who had earned, over years and without fanfare, the right to hold the most precious things. There is one more dimension to this story that deserves careful attention, and it is perhaps the most personal one. It is about Elizabeth herself, about who she was in private, about what the final chapter of her life reveals about the interior life of a woman who spent 70 years keeping her interior life almost entirely private. The public image of Elizabeth II, over 7 decades, was one of extraordinary consistency. She was, to an almost uncanny degree, the same in public in 2020 as she had been in 1960 and in 1980 and in every decade between and after. The same composure, the same attention, the same quality of self-containment that allowed her to be the focus of enormous events without appearing to be personally consumed by them. She was always there. She was always present. She was always doing the right thing at the right moment, with the right expression and the right words. She was, in the public dimension of her life, genuinely extraordinary at being what was required of her. But the private Elizabeth, the one known only to the very small number of people who were closest to her, was a more complex and more affecting figure. She had humor, as mentioned, but also depths of feeling that almost never became visible to the public because she considered them private and kept them that way. She had opinions about people and situations that were acute and sometimes surprising, but she held them inside because she believed, correctly, that it was not her place to express them in ways that would cause difficulties. She had a life of faith that was entirely real and entirely genuine and almost entirely invisible, because she did not use it publicly, and she did not use it to make herself appear more sympathetic. She simply had it, and it shaped everything, and she kept it between herself and God in the way she felt was appropriate. And she had, over the long decades of her reign, developed a particular capacity that is not often commented on, but that may be the most remarkable thing about her. She had the capacity to change. Not dramatically, not visibly, but really. To look at a situation she had previously assessed one way and find, on the basis of new evidence and longer observation, that her assessment had been wrong or incomplete, and to correct it quietly without fuss or fanfare. Most people, most institutions especially, find it genuinely difficult to revise prior assessments, particularly public ones, particularly where the original assessment was formed under conditions of significant pain and pressure. The tendency is to stick with the original judgment, to find evidence that confirms it, to avoid the discomfort of admitting that things have changed or that the original picture was not complete. Elizabeth did not do that. Her private assessment of Camilla changed, over years, in response to what she actually observed. And when it had changed to the point where she was genuinely confident in a new understanding, one that was not the public understanding, not the one the newspapers had formed and the documentaries had repeated, but her own, built from direct and sustained personal observation, she acted on it. She gave Camilla the sash and the gloves and the program. She gave her the morning of June the 2nd, 1953, in 3 wrapped objects. She gave her proof, in the most personal currency available to her, of what she had concluded. There is something in that, in the willingness to be changed by evidence, in the capacity to look again at a person you have known in painful circumstances and find something different from what you originally found, that feels important to acknowledge. Elizabeth was 95 years old when she made that public statement about Camilla. She was in her final year of life. She had been queen for 7 decades. She had seen more than most people could imagine, had lived through more, had carried more, and in her final chapter, she chose to do the harder thing, the braver thing, the thing that required her to move past what had been painful and toward what was actually true. That required character. It required the kind of character that is built over a long life through consistently choosing to look at things clearly, even when looking at them clearly is not comfortable. The objects in the wardrobe were the physical expression of that character. Not a grand gesture, not a public declaration, just a quiet, private, honest act. 3 things wrapped in tissue paper, placed on a shelf, given from one woman's hands to another's, in the understanding that the receiver would understand what they meant and would honor them accordingly. She did. She understood. She honored them. She kept them close, in the cedar-scented space at the back of her wardrobe, and she said nothing, and that silence was itself a form of honor. The most appropriate form, perhaps, for something given the way those things were given. That is the story, in the end. Not complicated, not dramatic in the conventional sense, just 2 women and a long, complicated relationship, and the private conclusion that was reached at the end of it, expressed in the most personal way available. And a cedar door, found open by people doing a routine job on an ordinary afternoon, revealing the evidence of something that had happened in private and been kept private, and that the world, eventually and partially, came to know about. The items are now properly housed at Windsor, in the care of the Royal Collection Trust. Plans for their eventual public display are in development. The gloves, the sash, the program, they will be seen one day by people who come to Windsor to look at the history they hold. A facsimile of the annotated page from the program will stand beside the original, the handwriting reproduced precisely so that the words can be read without risking the original. Remember, this moment belongs to God, not to us. Millions of people will read those words, and some of them, the ones who know the full story, of the cedar door and the tissue paper, of the gloves given by hand without paperwork, of the silence that was kept for as long as it could be kept, will understand that they are reading something that contains 2 stories. The story of the young woman who wrote those words on the morning she became queen, reaching for something to hold on to, and the story of the much older woman who gave those words, along with everything else, to someone she had decided was worthy of them. That second story is not a small one. It is, in its own quiet way, one of the most significant things Elizabeth did in her final months. Not because of what it meant for the public record, or for the institution's image, or for any calculable strategic purpose, but because it was real. Because it happened in private, between 2 people, without any audience, and without any expectation that it would ever be known. Because it was the true expression of what Elizabeth had actually concluded, at the end of a very long life and a very careful observation about the woman her son had always loved. She had decided Camilla could be trusted. She had decided Camilla was worthy, and she had acted on that decision in the most private and therefore the most honest way available to her, by giving her the things that mattered most. Camilla has not spoken about any of this publicly. She will not, and that silence is its own kind of statement, not a defensive one, not an evasive one, but a consistent one. She received something private, given in a private way, and she has kept it private. The act of breaking that privacy, even now, even after the items have been found and the story has reached the world, would be a different kind of act than the one that has been described in this story. It would be making public what was given privately. It would be explaining what was not meant to require explanation. She understood what those objects were when she received them. She understood what it meant that Elizabeth had given them to her. She did not need it spelled out, and she did not need it confirmed, and she did not need anyone else to witness it to make it real. It was real. It was enough. and the most appropriate response to it was the one she gave, to hold it privately, to protect its private nature, to let it be what it was, rather than what it could be turned into. That is a harder thing to do than it sounds. The pressure in royal life, as in all public life, to speak, to explain, to get ahead of the narrative, to tell your story before someone else tells it for you, that pressure is enormous and relentless, and it does not stop just because doing so would compromise something that mattered. Camilla felt that pressure. She chose anyway to stay quiet. She protected the gift by protecting its privacy. She honored Elizabeth by treating the things Elizabeth gave her the way Elizabeth would have wanted them treated. That is, in the end, what trust looks like when it is genuine and not performed. Not the announcement of it, not the documentation of it, simply the living of it, day by day, in private, without anyone watching. Not everything important in a life like Elizabeth's was on the public record. Not everything significant happened in view of cameras, or in the presence of official witnesses, or in rooms where the institution was watching. The most important things, the ones that defined who she actually was, as opposed to who she appeared to be in the performance of her public role, happened in the private spaces, in the quiet moments, in the rooms where the only people present were the ones she had chosen to have there. She built her public life on constancy and service and the absolute discipline of putting the role before herself. And in her private life, she built something quieter and smaller and in some ways more difficult, genuine relationships, real ones, ones that took time and required honesty and didn't follow any script because there was no script for them. Relationships that were not between Queen Elizabeth II and the public figures around her, but between Elizabeth the person and the people she had come to know, over years, as real. Her relationship with Camilla was one of those. Built slowly, out of unpromising materials, in circumstances that were genuinely complicated, it became, by the evidence of those cedar-lined shelves, by the evidence of those wrapped and carefully stored objects, by the evidence of those 5 penciled words given from one pair of hands to another, something that neither of them ever spoke about publicly, and that both of them understood without needing to. A cedar-panelled door, a folded sash with gold thread that still catches the light, a pair of kidskin gloves with a silver monogram on each wrist, a program with pencil notes in the margin, small things, ordinary-looking things, the kind of things that could easily be overlooked, that would mean nothing to someone who did not know the story behind them, but to the right person, given at the right moment, by someone who knew exactly what they were giving and to whom, they meant everything. They meant, I know who you are, I have been watching, I see you clearly, and I trust you with the most important thing I have. That is what a private room, and a cedar door, and a routine security sweep that nobody expected to find anything in, eventually gave back to the world. Not the headline version, not the dramatic version, the real version, underneath everything. A story about 2 women and a trust that was real and private and kept exactly as long as it could be kept, and that says something, in the end, about what honesty looks like between people who have both, in their very different ways, given a great deal to an institution that asks a great deal and gives back very little in terms of ordinary human freedom. They found a way, those 2 women, against the odds and across the complicated distance of everything that had come before. They found a way, and they kept it private, and what the wardrobe held was the proof of it. Not a small thing, not a small thing at all. One last thought, before we close. There is a version of this story that could be told as a story about royalty and scandal and reconciliation, and in that version the point would be the drama of it, the twist, the discovery, the unexpected ending. But that version misses the most important thing, which is also the simplest thing, which is that what happened between Elizabeth and Camilla was just a human thing that happened to occur inside an extraordinary institution, involving people whose lives were lived to an extraordinary degree in public. But strip all of that away, and what you have is 2 women who had a difficult relationship and who worked through it, and who arrived after many years at something genuine. And at the end of one of those women's lives, she gave the other one the things she loved most. That is a story as old as people. It does not require a palace or a crown to be meaningful. It happens in ordinary houses and ordinary families and ordinary lives all the time. People who started as adversaries, or who were thrown together by circumstances that made their relationship painful, sometimes find their way to something unexpected. Sometimes the very difficulty of what they have been through together is what creates the depth of understanding between them. You cannot build that kind of knowing on easy ground. It grows in harder soil, out of the willingness to keep looking at someone honestly, to keep revising your understanding when the evidence requires it, to keep choosing the real relationship over the comfortable assumption. Elizabeth had been doing that, quietly, consistently, privately, for years, and in the end, she gave Camilla the proof of it, not in public, not in a speech or a statement or a formal occasion, in a cedar-lined room, in wrapped tissue paper, from one pair of hands to another, the most private way there is. The world found out eventually, as the world tends to find out about things, through a routine sweep, through a cedar door, through the work of people doing their jobs properly, on an ordinary afternoon. The story came out in pieces and in whispers, the way private things come out when the people keeping them are careful, but the building they are kept in is large and full of people, and nothing stays entirely sealed forever. But the meaning of it, the real meaning, the part that matters, was never hidden at all. It was right there in the tissue paper and the gold thread and the silver monogram and the pencil in the margin. It was right there in 5 words, written by a 27-year-old woman on the morning she became queen, kept for 70 years, and given, in the end, to the person she trusted most to understand them. Remember, this moment belongs to God, not to us, she remembered. And she gave the proof of her remembering to someone who she believed would remember it too. That is the story, the whole of it, simple, in the way that the most important things are always simple, and not a small thing at all. End.